Hi everyone, I'm Rhea Favole and I'm the Principal Lawyer and CEO at Solvi Migration, an Australian immigration law firm. Before I founded Solvi, I spent 20 years working in Australian government, with immigration being the most relevant and long-serving. I spent around 12 years there in my career. That was in a range of senior roles, including time working in the Immigration Minister's office. Mind the Gap Australia is here to help employers and recruiters to understand what's actually happening in the labour market and what shortages really mean for your business, and how sponsorship can actually play a vital role in stabilising your workforce when it's approached properly and strategically. When I speak with employers and recruiters about sponsorship, the comments that I hear are quite familiar. Things like, oh no, we just work with local people, or we only look for candidates who already have work rights. That's another one that I hear quite a bit. That sounds fine. We'll let you know when we need something down the track is also another thing that I'll hear. Or we sponsored someone before and it was a disaster. We don't want that headache again. If any of these sound familiar, please let me know in the comments. So when we start to unpack those, though, from my perspective as a lawyer, from those conversations, a few patterns start to emerge. Sometimes the person that they sponsored wasn't actually sponsored. What they'd done was written a letter of support for someone on a working holiday visa, or a student visa, or a graduate visa, and they assumed that that counted towards a sponsorship. Other times they really had gone through the sponsorship process, and the whole experience was quite reactive and chaotic. It was poorly explained. There was no clear communication and no strategy. When there's no guidance, understandably, that actually leaves a bad taste. But what actually sits underneath all of this is something very simple. Most employers haven't had sponsorship explained properly. They've never had a legal partner who sits beside them, acts like their back office, and manages the whole process end to end so they can actually get on with operating their business rather than worrying about what's going on with the migration process. Sponsorship is not meant to be your job. Your job is finding the right people, and handling the legal system that brings them in is where our team comes in. So today, let's talk about what actually makes sense and makes sponsorship viable, not just in theory, not just in hearsay, as I like to say as a lawyer, but in the way that makes sense for businesses and how they operate in the real world in Australia. Here's what we're diving into first: why attracting and retaining good people is so difficult, and why this has nothing to do with your recruitment ability and everything to do with the labour market. Secondly, we're going to talk about why limiting yourself to candidates who already have work rights is one of the biggest barriers to building a stable workforce, and how employers misunderstand the temporary visas as well as the demographics. Third, what makes sponsorship viable, and why having the right legal back office is key to making sponsorship strategic, manageable, and just part of your everyday workforce planning. When I speak with employers or recruiters, one thing is consistent: they're exhausted trying to attract and retain good people. It feels like they're constantly advertising, constantly retraining, constantly replacing people who go and leave the moment that they actually become productive. But the moment you dig a little deeper, it does become clear that this isn't actually about poor recruitment. It's not about your business. It's not about your culture. What it is about is the labour market in Australia itself. If you've got one of the occupations that we focus on, nursing, aged care roles, skilled trades, construction, engineering, mining, those occupations appear on the skilled migration list for a reason. And that reason is that Australia doesn't have enough people locally to fill them. That shortage is actually structural, not personal. And yet employers keep trying to solve this using local strategies: more job ads, more recruiters, more shuffling inside the team, more training for people who don't have the foundational skills for the job, and then they wonder why nothing changes. And then when they look at migrants, they assume that someone with an accent maybe is a skilled migrant, when in reality that person may be on a working holiday or student visa, and they're here temporarily by design. They're not intended to create a long-term workforce stability. Well, here's the epiphany: most employers are not failing at recruitment, they are trying to solve a structural problem with tools that were not designed for it. Once an employer realizes this, everything will shift because we can finally start talking about the elephant in the room. We need strategies that actually work. Let's begin with what's really happening for employers in sectors like healthcare, aged care, construction, engineering, mining, other skilled trades. I hear the same thing over. We just can't keep people. We finally train someone and then they just up and leave. We don't get any suitable applicants. We've been recruiting for months and no one is properly qualified. Or we hear that people are throwing bucket loads of money at a casualised workforce, which is extremely costly and not got stability. None of us is surprised when you understand the actual labour market. If your occupation appears on the skilled migrants list, it's not a coincidence. It's not because you're not trying hard enough. It's not because other employers are somehow doing something magical. Your occupation that you're trying to hire is on that list because the government labour data, not just guesses, but actual data shows that Australia doesn't have enough people with those skills. Not in the hospitals, not in aged care facilities, not on construction sites, not in engineering firms, not in mining operations, not in regional Australia, not even in some of the metropolitan areas, across the board. So when employers say, let's just keep recruiting locally, they're actually working against the data. The shortage isn't something that you can fix with another ad or another recruiter. The shortage exists because the local supply is too small to meet the country's needs. That's the first mindset shift that employers need to make. The problem isn't your recruitment. The problem is the labour market. The next major issue I see is the idea that employers should only look to candidates who already have full work rights. This sounds simple, but actually one of the most damaging limitations that employers place on themselves. Because when you say we only want people with full work rights, you're selecting based on visa convenience, not based on skill, experience, or long-term suitability. And this creates enormous problem for you. For example, working holiday makers, they're wonderful people, excited young people, but they're here for an adventure. They're here to travel. They're not planning necessarily to settle with one employer for years to come. And they cannot bring dependents with them. And a lot of employers don't realize that. Even if someone is amazing, their visa may not allow for their partner or children to join them. And student visa holders, they may be great people, but they've got restricted work hours, and employers have absolutely no idea whether their qualification will lead to a long-term pathway. They need proper legal advice to understand and not just apply guesswork. Graduate visa holders, yes, they have full work rights, but that doesn't tell you whether their qualification actually aligns with the occupation that you want to sponsor. Did they have the right amount of study, and do you have them working in an occupation that's then going to allow you to sponsor them down the track? Again, employers shouldn't be expected to figure all of this out on their own. This is where a proper legal assessment comes in, and it's the part that most employers don't realize. Visa applicants cannot sponsor themselves. They cannot make themselves eligible. They cannot explain migration law to you, and they cannot create a long-term pathway without an employer. The employer has to take the lead with proper legal guidance. The strongest long-term candidates, the ones who want stability, who want to bring families, who want to commit to your business and being there in the long term, many of them may actually still be overseas and can only come through a sponsorship. Yet they never make it to the interview stage because you filter them out based on them having to have work rights. So employers are unintentionally shutting out the exact candidates that would be able to stay and rely on a visa category that was never intended for the long term. This is how businesses get stuck in the hire, lose, retrain, lose cycle. This is not a recruitment issue. This is a strategy issue. Now let's talk about what makes sponsorship actually viable. And this is where having the right legal back office becomes essential. Sponsorship is not simple. It's not just a form. It's not just something an employer should interpret from a government website. Sponsorship sits inside a complex legal system that requires alignment on several levels. First, the role actually has to align with Australia's skilled occupation definitions. And that's not just based on duties, not based on job titles. Employers tell us what the job involves, and then we determine the legal alignment. It's not something most businesses would be able to necessarily understand. Second, the business itself must be eligible to sponsor. Again, that's a legal assessment. We need to look at your business structure or structures, how the operations work, the compliance, the financial financial capacity, and whether the business is going to meet the requirements. This is not guesswork again. It is more legal work. And third, the candidate. This is where many employers accidentally oversimplify things. You cannot assess a candidate simply by looking at their CV or thinking they've worked really hard in my business and I want to keep them. A proper legal assessment involves looking at their qualifications against the Australian qualifications framework. The diploma or the degree from overseas does not automatically meet Australian standards. We will actually examine as lawyers the academic transcripts and we look at the competencies. We need to see whether or not they're going to, and in many circumstances, they need to have their skills assessed. And we need to see if they're going to meet the requirements. Fun fact, there's 42 different skills assessing authorities for migration purposes in Australia. Each of them has their own rules. We also need to determine whether English language requirements are going to apply or whether exemptions are going to apply under the skills assessment or the migration program. Employers, having a partner or children your employee may have, things like their health and character can also impact their eligibility for certain visas. And it's not something that a candidate should have to try and explain to you. This is what your legal team does for you. Our role is to act as your back office, not only just to assess, but also to manage each application and to communicate with you clearly so you know exactly what's happening, but you don't need to get involved day to day. You just need to be there to make the decisions and sign off. We direct and guide and give you the correct advice. You can keep running your business. Our role is to manage the whole legal infrastructure that allows you to access skilled, talented people that you actually need. That's what makes sponsorship viable, not because it's simple, but because you have the right team behind you. Today, we looked into 3 key things. First, why attracting and retaining good people has become so difficult and why this is a structural labour shortage and not a recruitment issue. Second of all, we looked at why limiting yourself to candidates who already have full work rights actually cuts you off from the strongest long-term candidates and keeps you stuck in a cycle of churn. Third, we looked at what actually makes sponsorship viable and how to get the right legal back office that transforms the sponsorship from something that is overwhelming into something that just becomes a strategic part of manageable BAU. If today's episode made you stop and maybe pause for a moment and think where your workforce strategy is actually going to come from, well, then the next best step is to understand whether sponsorship is even on the table for your business. You can complete our simple 60-second business eligibility check online. It will give you a clear sense of whether or not the business is likely to qualify for sponsorship of skilled overseas workers. And if you already have a specific situation or role or candidate in mind, you can always book a consultation with our team of lawyers. You can do that directly at www.solvi.com.au. Once again, thank you for joining me on Mind the Gap Australia. I'm Rhea Favole. Please do like, subscribe and share, and I look forward to seeing you on the next episode where we can continue to Mind the Gap Australia.